Hi, so I have this script I wrote around November 2018. It's about a fan game I liked and the state of the Pokémon series. Problem is just that it's the state of the Pokémon series back in 2018, and I don't want to burst any bubbles here just in case some people are as clueless as I am, but the current year is 2020. In other words, things have changed. That mainly being the release of the newest Pokémon games, Pokémon Sword and Pokémon Shield. I still wanted this video to be made without changing the contents too much though. Because of this, I decided to make slight changes to make the script aware of Pokémon Sword and Shield, but kept the larger points the same. The games didn't change much regarding them anyway. But I can't just ignore Sword and Shield, so I will talk about them. Just not in this video. It would be unfair to take the spotlight away from Pokémon Reborn, because I believe it deserves it. So there will be a follow-up video where I talk about my thoughts on the new titles, especially in relation to my opinions from this video and if they've changed or not. Alright, now on with the thing. If someone asked me to name the game series that most influenced my childhood, I would without hesitation answer Pokémon. There were some phases where I lost interest during my teenage years, but those didn't last for long. I don't think I could ever grow out of it entirely after spending so much time with the franchise. Heck, my first experiences with Pokémon come from before I could even read. My parents tell me I was about 5 at the time, and my brother, already a teenager, had to read and explain everything to me. From that point on, always owning a recent Nintendo handheld and every Pokémon game I could get my tiny hands on was a given. But unfortunately, it has also been a trend for me to enjoy each new generation of games less and less. I forced myself to finish Omega Ruby simply because the Delta episode in the post-game looked promising, but it still took me about 4 years to do so, and Pokémon Sun actually became the first game of the franchise to not be finished by me. I'm currently sitting at around 9 hours playtime and get bored within minutes every time I try to pick it up again. Ultra Sun and Moon I didn't even buy. Because of that I began thinking maybe the series just isn't for me anymore. My preferences in games have definitely changed over the years. Action titles, especially platformers, are now a big passion, whereas strategy and turn-based games generally fell by the wayside. But I must have still been interested in Pokémon, since I kept coming back to it through random sparks of motivation. Not the main series games though. I decided to try out a bunch of fan-made ones, none of which were able to float my boat except for one. A yet-to-be-finished RPG Maker passion project with over 7 years of work put into it managed to grab my attention and never let go. This is what I'm here to talk about today. What does creator Amethyst do differently than Game Freak's titles, and how applicable would these ideas be to them? This is about Pokémon Reborn and how a fan game out of all things was the one that could make me enjoy playing Pokémon again. Pokémon games are easy. This is not a secret and nothing new at all. The games themselves being quote-unquote too easy is the reason people started creating their own self-imposed challenges. The original hard mode rule set called Nuzlocke is a term known to many a fan. Its popularity shows that the demand for challenging Pokémon games is certainly there. I've even heard a lot of people say that Pokémon without a Nuzlocke, or a rival lock, or a randomized Soul-Link 2v2 versus is pretty boring to them. Looking at the standard rules of a Nuzlocke, it becomes quite clear what players seem to be seeking. If a Pokémon faints, it can't be used anymore, and players are only allowed to catch the first new mon they encounter on each route. While not a part of the 2 core rules, as an addition people generally regard a battle where you lose all your Pokémon a total game over for that playthrough. Some players also like to restrict the use of in-battle items, such as healing potions for example. We can see, players want the game to be more difficult, and Reborn is just that. In fact, it's so difficult that attempting a Nuzlocke-like challenge would in almost every case be a suicide mission, especially if the player doesn't know what to expect. So, let's look at how Pokémon Reborn tries to achieve difficulty. First of all, and this is something made clear very early on, the Pokémon League challenge of collecting all the badges and fighting the Elite Four is somewhat different here. There are not 8, but a total of 18 gym leaders, one for each type, and all of them have a full team of 6 with movesets much more competitive than what we're used to. Their mons will also carry useful items and receive even more power through Eevee training, perfect natures and good IVs. Don't worry if you've never heard of these things before. The important takeaway is that the gym leaders' team members are actually well-trained Pokémon, which makes a lot of sense since they are supposed to be some of the very best trainers in the region. But this alone wouldn't be enough to make them as tough as they are. The other big factor is strategy. as each leader fights only on their own very specific terms. Terms meaning field effects in this case. Fields are where your Pokémon fight. Which field out of the 37 available ones will be chosen depends on the environment the player is in. Fighting on top of a volcano would be represented in battle with the superheated field, whereas in a thick forest you would get a forest field. Each field has different rules or effects which help in keeping the gameplay varied but also add realism in a lot of cases. For example, if you're underwater, fire type moves will be weaker. These effects can range from being pretty subtle to being absolutely game changing. It can get difficult remembering all the changes made by a field though, as there are quite a lot of them. Some might be very situational and won't really affect players too often, but they can't know that at first. All they see are 4 pages of effects to keep in mind while battling. Intimidated players might choose to ignore notes or skim through them, potentially missing out on the most significant bits. To me, some very important effects are the ones detailing how fields can be changed during battle. Use Blizzard and Mountain becomes Snowy Mountain. Use moves such as Eruption or Heatwave and grassy terrain turns into Burning Field. Suddenly, fields can not only be used, but also combated, opening up some new strategic avenues. Faced with gym leaders who have powerful Pokémon and synergies between their field and their team, players will have to make decisions. Do I ignore the field, abuse it as much as I can, or do I try and destroy it if possible? All of this gives fights an element of strategy and decision making. And while I do appreciate this, I would have liked simplifying the mechanics just a little and focusing less on the nitty gritty. The main games actually have some fields as well, which are a lot more straightforward. Those are always sort of special though and have to be activated through certain moves or abilities. In Pokémon Reborn, you get a field no matter where you fight. It's an actual part of the world integrated into the gameplay, and while not perfectly executed, adds to the game's unique charm and gives every new place a different feel. There is also another major way through which Amethyst adds difficulty. If you have ever played a Pokémon game yourself, you might know how easy it is to beat them with just one Pokémon alone, because it will quickly gain levels and become unstoppable. The most common system to prevent this would be to add level limits depending on the amount of badges the player has acquired. The main series games do this to an extent. If, let's say, you don't own the second badge in Pokémon Emerald, then mons above level 20 won't obey you. Meaning when you choose a move, sometimes they will oblige, but they might also decide to just not, or straight up take a nap. This only works in Pokémon from other people's save files though, which means players can still breeze through the games as long as they are using their own members. Pokémon Reborn takes the idea one step further and applies it to every Pokémon, even the ones you caught yourself. The level limits are pretty strict too. This is how it is distributed. Each square represents a badge and the corresponding level where disobedience kicks in. For example, without the first badge, only Pokémon up to level 20 will listen to the player. After receiving it, they will listen up to level 25. Most gaps are only 5 levels apart, meaning players are very confined in the level range of the Pokémon. Being over the limit is usually not advisable, but fortunately common candies allow players to flexibly adjust levels and play around the mechanic. For only $300 they lower the level of a Pokémon by 1. Don't worry about going over the limit while battling though. As of the newest version of the game, that won't immediately result in disobedience, which for most players was a nice quality of life update. I for one preferred how it used to be, because it meant players had to strategically manage their team members' levels and experience gain. Suddenly there would be questions to ask like, what is the optimal level where my Pokémon won't overshoot mid-fight but also not be too weak? Who should I give experience to during battle, and when and how would I even do that? Simply speaking, players had to make decisions. Now there are none because there is never a reason not to level as high as possible. It will always be better to have your Pokémon at that level before the fight and just use common candies after it if need be. There's nothing to think about anymore. Sure, the old way is restricting, but out of limitations comes creativity, right? Combine the strict level caps with the fact that every gym leader and most important trainers have a full team, and players are almost forced to have 6 Pokémon too. Promoting this style of play is definitely appreciated by a specific demographic, but probably not by enough players to make it a good design strategy for Game Freak. Restricting level limits also makes designing challenges a little easier on Amethyst. With it, she will know exactly at what level range players should be, without having to account for the occasional starter-only run 20 levels above all trainers, or the team-wide experience share players might or might not be using. If all of this works, it might relieve Pokemon players of the stress of constantly feeling like they have to balance the game themselves. I accidentally leveled too much and now the game is not fun anymore. It's not a thing you want players to fear, but unfortunately a lot more common for the main games than one would think. In Reborn, they can hopefully just enjoy playing in the confined space of the game's rules. Some people like that better. Taking another look at the Nuzlocke rule set revealed something else players seem to care about, and this is variety. The "you can only catch the first Pokemon you find" rule makes it so players don't have a lot of team building choices, and will often have to use mons they wouldn't have touched otherwise. Reborn sort of accomplishes this by being very strict in terms of which Pokemon are given out to players and when. Classic staples you would see every player use in any other Pokemon game because they're so iconic or just plain strong are simply not available, at least for some time. And that might mean 10 hours, but it might also mean much more. I was probably 100 hours in and my team members were around level 90 when I first reached the Ghastly event. Now, not every Pokemon will be locked away and kept hidden in a shed in the mountains until this late into the game, but Amethyst still makes sure most available Pokemon in the beginning are rather weak, and then the longer you go the better the options become. This also makes fights harder because opponents tend to have mons of a generally higher quality than the player, which I found to be a nice change of pace compared to other games. But it's not like you can't beat strong trainers. I talked at length about how dangerous leaders can be, but in close vicinity to their gyms, wild Pokemon that happen to be very effective against their strategy can usually be caught. This and the shortage of high quality Pokemon also emphasize variety, because it promotes changing your team regularly. A supremely important factor in the game since trainers can be really hard and field effects can do drastically different things. I have heard of people who made new teams for almost every gym leader to be prepared as best as they could. There's just one more thing I want to talk about when analyzing the Nuzlocke rules. Fainted Pokemon are lost forever. A lot of rule sets force players to give Pokemon nicknames to create a stronger bond between player and team member. Almost no one would allow resetting when things don't go your way, and a whiteout means game over. Players seem to be seeking consequences. They want to feel like mistakes really matter instead of just trying again and again until it works out. Players want to feel the tension that comes with potential punishment. Or at least some of them seem to. In terms of battle consequences, Reborn does lag a little bit, but this is by design. We can lose fights, it's not a problem. In fact, more often than not, it's probably assumed players will lose, learn from the experience, adjust their strategy, and challenge the problem again with a different plan or team. There are narrative-related actions and consequences in the game, but that doesn't really apply here, so I'll just gloss over them. So, could the main series do something like this? Probably not. The main argument for the franchise being quite easy to complete is that the games are marketed towards children. I can't know exactly what Game Freak's target audience is, and I can't pretend to, but what I do know is that making drastic changes a la Reborn would most likely alienate a large number of people. And probably without merit too, because most of the people who would enjoy that are presumably buying the main series games anyway. If they don't like the difficulty or how things are handled regarding it, they can just keep playing their challenge rule sets. But why do players come back to the games so easily? What is it that they love about them? I believe the answer to that has to be something all the games share. The world. I think I can safely say I'm not the only one who as a child used to wish for the Pokemon world to be real. It was such a beautiful and happy place that I would often find myself imagining what it would be like if it actually existed, writing a bunch of lists about the Pokemon I would catch and so on. It was obviously fiction, yet it felt so real. In his book The Art of Game Design, Jesse Schell talks about the idea of transmedia worlds and their strengths, using Pokemon as one example. A transmedia world is a fictional universe that can be accessed through multiple media. Pokemon started out as video games with the successful Pokemon Red and Green in Japan. Based on them, a manga, a TV show, a card game, and a movie were created. None of these different media betrayed the source material in any way, but also managed to give fans different experiences. The games were interactive, fun, and established the rules and intricacies of the world. The anime was a long-running journey you could go on every single day, the trading card game allowed for social fun with friends, and the movie offered a tight emotional narrative. All of these were gateways to the same world. the world of Pokémon, which continues to feel more real with every entry. Each media can enhance the others. Like how the anime, for example, can give you a better feeling for how the Pokémon and their fights look than the technically limited games at the time. Suddenly, players' perceptions of the world as a whole would change, just because they have seen some episodes of the anime. Like this, a transmedia world can come into existence, which can stay relevant for a long time, and induce very strong feelings in its fans. Think Star Wars as one very big one, for example. Shell says worlds like these can turn into a person's individual utopia, a place they wish they were a part of, and this love can potentially last for a lifetime. This has to explain what I'm feeling as well. Thinking back, besides the games, there were so many gateways to this world present in my life, such as movies, the card game, the anime, toys, plushies, blankets, towels, figurines, a Monopoly game, and probably much more I can think of right now. I believe one very popular feature from the games Pokémon HeartGold and SoulSilver is especially useful when trying to examine this love. Pokémon following the player around. In these two remakes, the first Pokémon in your party would always follow behind the player's avatar when running through the game world. Upon interacting with it, players would only get some repetitive dialogue, a little emote, and maybe an item that the Pokémon found. But even though there was not much meat to it, people seemed to universally love the feature. I think that's because it makes the world feel a lot more real, since you put the Pokémon into the actual game world the player can explore. This is the reason I make distinctions between certain worlds here. Games often switch between varying styles of gameplay. To facilitate that, they tend to change the interface as well. These different experiences are called modes, but I think worlds fits well in this case, so I will be using the terms interchangeably. An example of modes can be found in Yoshi's Island, where you go through levels like this, but you might also encounter bonus stages where the game looks like this, and the controls are quite different. This doesn't happen in Super Mario World, for example. For bonus stages, you stay in the same mode, keeping your usual controls and interface. One of the most classic mode changes occurs in RPGs, when you encounter enemies on the explorable overworld map and enter the game's battle mode. This also happens in Pokémon games. In general, different modes should look distinct to make it obvious to the player when a mode change happens. On that note, modes should also always fulfill distinct purposes, because if they were too similar, there wouldn't be a need for having multiple modes in the first place. Though, if they are too different, modes or worlds might feel very separated from another. And maybe you're starting to see where this is going now as I'm switching back to the term worlds. I think in Pokémon games, this feeling of disconnection can become a problem since most Pokémon the players actually visually see are part of the battle world and not the overworld world. But that's the one you spend most of your time in, the one where dialogue and story arcs happen, and the one you actively explore as part of the game. This makes the out-of-battle world feel more real than the battle world. But unfortunately, it's also the one most void of the creatures that make the Pokémon world so special in the first place. The Pokémon. And I think it's because of this that introducing more mons in the outside mode will make the game world feel more alive. This could be realized by a following mechanic much like the one in HeartGold and SoulSilver, but such an undertaking would take a lot of work since Pokémon are 3D models now instead of simple sprites. The team would have to create those and the respective animations for well over 800 Pokémon, which is a lot. But I guess for Sword and Shield it would just be half of that, so hey, silver linings. But never mind that for now. What I'm trying to say is this. Having all Pokémon follow you around seems like too much to ask for, but maybe we can take some hints from Pokémon Reborn when trying to make the game world feel more alive and the fantasy stronger by incorporating the overworld mode. Reborn puts Pokémon everywhere in the game world, much more often than Game Freak does. Prior to the newest games, that is. And while Game Freak now fills their worlds with more Pokémon than they used to, the way they go about doing this is different from Reborn, which still manages to be unique in its own way. I think a lot of this also comes down to the choice of setting Reborn made. This right here is the world map, and all of this stuff is one big city, the city of Reborn. It's where players start their adventure and spend most of their time in, especially during the earlier parts of a playthrough. And since the city is a complete dump, plagued by terrorist attacks, slums filled with criminals and addicts, and water that is essentially just toxic waste, there is not a lot of green. And not a lot of green means not a lot of random encounters like in regular Pokémon games, where you spend almost all of your time in nature. As a result, Amethyst has to introduce Pokémon differently, mostly through scripted events. Players might, for example, try to help this person who is asking for money. Well, he doesn't really show his gratitude, but after paying him 3 times, he leaves to take a nap, allowing the player access to another house with a traumatized Esper. Give it a Pokesnack and it will join your party. On a nice day, the player might also find a Teddy Ursa just roaming the streets, and after looking for it all over the district, will finally be able to capture it. Or how about the Hungry Whismer here, or this Tynamo in a back alley which only appears during stormy weather. Again, finding Pokemon like this makes a huge difference when it comes to creating believability and a strong fantasy. Another huge part is that because of this design, we don't have as many random encounters, which generally don't feel very special. Which story sounds more interesting? Hey, this is my Pachirisu, I caught it randomly in one of those identical looking patches of grass. Or, one day I saw some kids bully a Pachirisu near the Grand Hall, so I beat them up and saved it. Thankful and with nowhere to go, it decided to join my team and we quickly became friends. I know which one I prefer, but maybe that's just me. Through varied scenarios and incorporating the overworld world, your Pokemon team starts to feel like a ragtag group assembled through circumstances and chance, and new members are more of a reward than a typical random encounter would be. Saving a scared Pansear from the rain, or receiving the lonely Growlithe of a recently deceased policeman because you rescued many other police forces during an attack, or finding and fighting a tribe of Nuzleaf in a hidden clearing just feels so much more impactful. But it's not just here in the city. This also extends to other parts of the region, like the constant fighting between the Tauros and the Buffalond on Route 1 for example. Players have the choice to side with and gain the favor of one of the Pokemon, which will help with some puzzles. All of this makes Pokemon and the encounters with them feel so much more special. Another thing to take note of is how a lot of the random encounters that are present in the city are handled. They're used sparingly, but players often have to put in a little work to earn those spots. For example, after beating him, this old man will allow players access to the secret garden he's been nurturing. A really nice change of pace in the industrial and destroyed city that is reborn. What I showed you here is but a fragment of the amount of events the game has to offer though. There is so much more to do and see, which brings me to the last main part of the video. This game is huge. I amassed more than 150 hours with it so far, and again, it's not even finished yet. Granted, that playtime includes a lot of other stuff like special encounters and side quests. I already mentioned some events, but those were mainly focused on relatively short Pokemon encounters during the early stages of the game. But when looking at side quests and the like, there is so much more to speak of. There's this, let's call him vendor for example, who, for only $500, promises the player a quote, fantastic beast so badass it's been heralded among dragons for centuries. Unfortunately, right after the purchase, the powerful creature is stolen and the player is left with nothing. We get a lead where to go to next, and to keep things short, are conned out of some more money, only to find out that the thief had the Pokemon stolen from him too. What follows is a wild goose chase, spanning a huge part of the game until the whole thing is finally resolved around level 80. The entire mission is a unique take on a classic Pokemon trope, with a great payoff most of you can probably see coming from a mile away. Or maybe you would rather spend your time scanning the bottom of a lake in search of the name tag of someone from the evil terrorist group the player is in conflict with. She died during an earlier aerial battle, fell into the water, and now her partner in crime, who left the organization, wants to finally find out her full name. Looking through bodies at the bottom of a lake might or might not make a local angler assume the avatar to be a murderer, but at least that helps with negotiations. Joining a street gang and raiding a grump rich lady's home was also a lot of fun, even though it didn't really make much sense for our character to do. If you're into puzzles, you're in luck too. Here's one where you try to use the Pokemon in the cages to conduct a prison break. And here is one where the player is asked to resolve some interesting problems based on chess. Thinking outside the box, or in this case the chessboard, is a must. If this sounded interesting, well, good, because you can expect a lot more content like it from the game. If it didn't, then I probably shouldn't mention the street gang thing, and the puzzles are not optional and part of the main quest. Speaking of which, the game is obviously not just side quests and encounters. Going through the main story alone will very likely still take upwards of 60 hours or so. Luckily, the experience never felt stretched out, but very dense and eventful. This might come from the fact that the player spends so much time in a city instead of going from route to route. A city allows for back and forth pacing because everything is in one place, whereas a route system often leads to somewhat boring structures like this. Naturally, this also comes down to how much there is to do. Generally, a city would be more lively and eventful than a field or a cave, which makes starting in one a good idea in my opinion. But nailing this part is not easy either. Here it only works so well because no matter where you go, there's always something to see or explore. In fact, I would argue the city alone probably has more and better content than a huge number of Pokémon fan games and maybe even some main series titles as a whole. It is so filled to the brim with distractions, it sort of reminds me of Breath of the Wild, where players could collect these little leaf guys called Korok seeds, of which there were 900 in total. This is an absolutely astronomical amount, not meant to all be hunted by the player. There are so many because the world is gigantic and freely explorable, and the design team most likely wanted to make sure players would find some seeds no matter where they went. Reborn feels very much like that to me in terms of there being more to find than one player will probably be able to. As a result, there is content no matter where you go, but don't expect a huge open world because of the Zelda comparison. The experience is still a guided one. The narrative mainly follows the string of pearls method, where you have periods of interactive play and control, and periods of non-interactive story serving as bridges or string between the pearls. In other words, you can freely do whatever you want in A. Once you achieve your objective there, you get some linear story progression and are guided to B, where the cycle begins anew. This mission to cutscene pattern is very common in games. But with Reborn you also have the added benefit of being able to go back to places you have been before and exploring them again like you would in, say, Metroidvanias. Amethyst uses this really well. It often feels like the world remembers the player's actions. This can happen through various means, but the biggest and most impactful one to me was this. After spending so much time in the ugly rundown city, there is a point where the player can come back to it for a while, and some hours of adventuring later, when you finally return, this is what the place looks like. Almost everything in this huge city was restored, and with that comes new places to explore, new NPC dialogue, a bunch of new quests and so on. The player can basically explore the city from scratch again, and this feels so satisfying because, as I said, at that point players had already spent so much time in the dump. So to now see it in a different light is super refreshing. And it's made even tastier since the player had to go through some grueling trials to even get to this point and actively fought for the city, pretty much enabling the whole transformation. NPCs might also act differently now. The bullies from before are hanging out under the bridge we first fought them on, and Been Good swears it. The last of the troop seems to genuinely feel bad about what he did, which serves as some surprisingly satisfying closure considering the original event only took about 3 minutes and happened like 40 hours ago. In general, the environment and the NPCs show the impact the avatars and, in extension, the players' actions had on the world. This is an important form of feedback and a great reward for players. How many RPGs are out there where you can save the entire world, but when you come back to the tiny starting village, all the NPCs just say the same things they said during the first hour into the game? I don't think I could find feedback like this in main series Pokémon games, or interesting puzzles, or so much side content to mix things up. Portraying a gigantic buzzing city like Reborn is especially hard to accomplish. Game Freak had a really big one in terms of size with Lumio's city from Pokémon X and Y, but unfortunately that one feels pretty empty and shallow. To be fair though, the biggest focus of Pokémon Reborn is obviously the city of Reborn, so naturally most of the resources would be put into that. Not to mention the game has been in development for over 7 years now. Such a long development cycle could almost never be feasible for the production of most games. The fact of the matter is, Pokémon Reborn is just a fan game. But it is still a Pokémon game, and with that come certain expectations. I say this mainly because of some of the criticisms I've seen targeted towards Reborn. The interesting part is that I find myself agreeing with almost everything I read, but still came to a different conclusion in the end. I liked it, they did not. It's possible that I was just expecting or hoping for different things coming into the experience. If you're used to and love the main games, Pokémon Reborn might disappoint. It doesn't have the typical Nintendo polish we are also spoiled by, for example. And there are a lot of small and some major gripes I have with the game, which I believe can mostly be attributed to the developer's inexperience. Excessively hard puzzles or a lack of transparency are some examples. The narrative trying very hard to be dark and explore deep themes also does not always work. But judging by the rest of this video, it should not come as a surprise to anyone that most of these things just didn't really matter to me. And this is why I love fan games. Much like, say, a Skyrim mod, they allow fans to take an existing formula and change it to what they wish the original was like. Amethyst made the Pokemon game that resonated with her. And I guess that version of Pokemon just pushed exactly the right buttons for me too. Some of those I haven't even mentioned yet, like the inclusion of a skip button which lets you run through dialogue and events a lot more quickly, as well as a general speed up mode. Since the main games play really slowly, especially nowadays, these options are much appreciated. Another cute little detail is that every egg looks different depending on the Pokemon inside. Gym leaders being much more involved in the story, as if they were actually the important trainers that they should be, is particularly nice. They also have a lot of personality. Rawr. The game is more challenging, its world feels richer, and there is just so much more to do and see than in a regular Pokemon game. Something like the city restoration, the moment I fell helplessly in love with Reborn, wouldn't exist in the main series title. But I'm not blaming Game Freak. Like discussed earlier, doing certain things the way Reborn does them would rarely be feasible, and much more often alienate a huge part of their player base. The main games have a lot going for them and make a ton of people happy, and even those who have problems with them or the directions they're taking are still playing them, meaning the games can't be that bad after all. Or maybe the power of Pokemon's transmedia world is just so great. Whatever it is, Pokemon main games are as popular as they are for a reason, which doesn't mean I consider Reborn lesser, just like I wouldn't consider the main games lesser. No one way is necessarily wrong or right, they're just different is all. After all, this was never a story about the perfect Pokemon game. It wasn't even a story about a Pokemon game I would widely recommend, but a story about a niche game filled with love and detail that felt like it was made specifically for me. And who knows, maybe, just maybe, it was made for you too.